Hey, what's up? It's been a while. I just wanted to briefly talk about why I decided to make this video because I feel like it might be pretty abrupt seeing this in your sub box. So, last year I hit this point where I was like, I really love reviewing, I want to keep doing it, but I feel like my thoughts about things and the way that I kind of look at certain genres of music, certain tropes in music has gotten a little bit played out, at least to me. So, I thought a good way to kind of break out of that would be to cover a record that I love enough. Because if I'm just endlessly interested in something, my thoughts about it are just gonna keep flowing. I will say I do hyperfixate on a lot of very specific details of the record itself and the album cover and the band's story. So just be aware that the more familiar you are with this record, the more sense this video is gonna make. And I'm not trying to tell you how to live your life. I don't know what attracted you specifically to this video, but I will say a really easy way to become more familiar with it is to watch the documentary that I put a link to in the description. I mean, I love it enough to the point where I specifically referenced it a couple times in this video. A lot of why I decided to cover this record specifically is just how I felt after watching it one time in my friend's basement. So I would say if you're interested, maybe check that out, but regardless, I hope you get something out of this video. I think that this little motherfucking thing might actually be my favorite album cover ever. Of course, this whole undertaking was no more than them loosely screwing around in whichever area of, I guess, Utica, Indiana, but Will Oldham happened to just capture this transient spark where everything had landed transcendentally. And of course, in one sense, the image will always look extemporaneous and just like a rough outtake, but I suspect had any aspect of this ended up slightly off, the mundane elements that actually make it up would be the only thing you would see in it. It could have been dull to the eyes, but precisely how it is, so much seems to actively bounce off of it. Everything's scarily exact about this shot. I imagine invisibly magic strung between Will's mind and his eyes in the camera, between his camera and the scene, between his prior strategizing and his arranging, between his arranging and timing, things like that. The endless combinations of things. Through every position that every tangible and intangible thing that went into it had in space and time. For an instant, the outside world just seemed to revolve around them to make this work. And the whole picture of Spiderland actually feels about that one in a million to me. It's as if one detail of the cover or the record itself or the band's story might make contact with another in my mind and then give off these specific chemicals that I feel this otherworldly amount of personal resonance in, and then reverse so more reactions can happen, and traces of these just end up laced throughout the crevices of my mind, which leaves me perfectly enchanted. And it feels like this could happen with any two details here, and that's what's so fascinating about my experience with this record. It feels like everything has an immediate connection to everything else, so this makes the idea of solidifying some of the nonsense I feel for this record into words that much more intimidating, but I thought it would be worth the investment to start, since everything I understand about this record can only enhance what I get out of it and stimulate more thought about it. And I think that you feel looking at this that these guys are overconfidently riding out some giddy high, that they're caught up in this testosterone-fueled glory, and this is exactly what youth looks like, and how you experience it as this fast, intoxicating blur. And I think that the relentlessly evanescent nature of things that are pure and genuine and vivid is something that these guys appear to capture from the outside with this one gem of a project. And just in concept, everything that happens at this age seems to have this unmatched power over our memories, because it's as if there's this point in youth where the amount of stimulation we experience makes our emotions split off and expand into these more drastic highs and lows, because we haven't lived long enough to see certain motifs repeat themselves in time yet. So every slight development to our life hits as life or death, and that's how it's solidified in our history. And to whatever consequence, this depth and purity of feeling can never truly be experienced again. And some of these tracks feel like they directly cut back through to mental states from when your emotions had just been split and deepened, and they just depict such rudimentary psychological responses like the social fear in Donnie Man, or the brash destruction of a relationship in Nosferatu Man, which I'll talk more about later. But regardless, I think you definitely experience them that way because Brian's vocals are so dramatic and they make time stop. and you can definitely see the pull of these extremes in the cover. Part of why is this flat decision to drop the color and leave it achromatic. I think this actually gives the illusion of added dimension and makes looking at it like seeing through another pair of eyes, because it adds a certain darkness to it, and I think at this age your darkness can seem so much more lifelike than your joy. It also reminds me of how undiagnosed mental illness manifests in the brain and makes everything you see naturally look a lot murkier. It's as if your optic nerve, so what connects your brain to your eyes, was just like squeezed and wrung out and left bent or irregularly angled, so all phenomena started to look cast over and deformed and disfigured, since your perspective on so many things is warped from cognitive distortions. And so enhanced, it would have to cause some kind of strain on the physical makeup of your reality and make everything inside of you feel so unstable. It would feel like everything you see could just be pulled apart and disperse or start flickering or blinking in any second, constantly having your perceptions of things freakishly pop out of place like eyes out of sockets. And I feel like after you kind of look at the cover and register this lens into the world, it can influence your mind to contort the scenes in the lyricism to look more disturbing. To use Breadcrumb Trail as an example, I always picture this track taking place in like the sketchiest possible carnival, just irresponsibly thrown together in the middle of nowhere. It would feel more obvious and menacing that it's been prearranged to look like fun. There's that rigidity about it, and that key roller coaster image would just look like a gnarled clump of cold metal with something evil about it and run rickety. Its nuts and bolts wouldn't be explicitly bolted down, so you could easily visualize it collapsing, and it would all take place under an overcast sky. I think it's worth trying to draw out inconspicuous qualities of the imagery in this record. It makes it look that much more daunting, and you can certainly do the same for this cover. So many parts of this are just like this sharp pang to my subconscious. Just the idea of wandering deep down networks of backroads where there's nothing for miles and stumbling upon this thing that's only in the natural world because of corporate motives is pretty bleak. And when you know that the water they're in is likely sickly and full of toxins, you feel them on your skin too looking at it. And there's just something about the derelict structure of what remains and the weariness that kind of swirls around it from the impact. It just looks severely empty, and it has this stern presence about it, and to my eyes it's like the blackest parts of it are bolted into it, and they're kind of acting as sharp vacuums, just pulling my eyes into them. And that makes this pure, glorious, youthful exultation radiating in the center feel that much more impossible and uncanny. Also, I think it's kind of hard not to feel like something looks kind of off or suspicious about this place. Like, if paranormal activity were to happen anywhere, it would have to be somewhere this seemingly insignificant. I would almost be surprised if ghosts didn't kind of stalk it. So if you were there, you'd just be in constant anticipation of something ghastly smacking itself in front of you and a pang of horror being sent through your body. But simultaneously, this idea that the true nature of reality could easily be completely different would kind of swirl around in your stomach and potentially interest and attract you. To me, a similar mysteria actually hangs above specifically Breadcrumb Trail's narrative. There's a certain aimlessness about it, kind of a wandering quality, and it's all suspiciously vague, but I feel like when you look at the broad picture of it, it feels like it's coming out of how ambiguous everything is when you're younger, and just the wonder in everything and how enchanting things can be. And touches like Brian's bellowing and the instrumental peaks feel thrilling and legitimately almost triumphant enough to just take up all the sensation in your body. They almost feel hopeful. Like, there's an aspect of that pure, unadulterated hope that you can only really feel before you're grown up, just shooting out of this all wobbly and unsteady, and it just makes me nervous. The roller coaster also quickly drives all of this momentum into the narrative, so it's really hard to ignore the point where it begins when I'm trying to interpret it and break it into some greater meaning. At the crux of this is some kind of internal flight within the narrator, and you know something about the effect that it's having, and the head rush it's causing is just unearthly. Like, something here is so powerful and profound to the point where they have no choice but to fully fall all the way into it, whether they're ready or not, and just be tossed into some kind of wider absurdity. And that fortune teller image kind of implies that something about this might have conceptual significance later. It has a generally foreboding effect. It's just that what all of this actually represents is undefined, so it kind of forces one to just let it all smear into a subjective blur in their mind. But Regardless, I think there's something incredibly special about the nature of all the potential interpretations of this. Specifically, I think there's so much to understand about the chemistry between the imagery isolated, regardless of how it's all spun together narratively, but as is, it's quite simple and unassuming, and I actually think that that makes it, because it allows each image to, by default, be stressed in your mind. You see each fully for what it is, and it allows them to kind of stretch into what you associate them with. And then it's just easier for them to come together and kind of transfigure into these new meanings on top of everything. But I think the fortune teller image and her association to mysticism and the occult and really everything not grounded in science is pretty indisputable and would be consistent among everyone. And I think the detail at the end of this, where she kind of blushes, is supposed to represent this hint of romantic feeling between her and the narrator. And to me, this is a perfect point of contact, because I think that when you're younger, the first few times that the suggestion of love hits your system, it kind of shocks you, and you start to connect the same things that you associate with mystic forces and the amount of power that they have to the mental image you have of you two, just because of the strength of the feeling and how foreign it is to you. But in theory, limerence doesn't even need to be the subject of this track, and I think adults can do this too. Like, sometimes people settle, but there are still adults that subscribe to religions. It's just hard for a person to stay fully conscious of. It's in the back of your mind, and it's not necessarily something you have complete control over. And I do still think it happens mostly at this age, or if you're mentally ill, because you don't really have a stable sense of reality. So your mental image of any mortal or temporal aspect of your life can just slide straight outside the laws of nature. The problem is that your head is more elastic, or it's liquefied and on the loose. The way I like to think of it, when stimuli hits the brain and turns into a perception of something, it also collapses into liquid. So it can freely and directly affect whatever's already there and make it merge or fuse into something else via osmosis. So your entire brain is essentially just this unintelligible flood that's highly disconnected from everything, and constantly sloshing around and changing. So I think it's fitting that this track's instrumental is maybe the most emotionally dynamic on the whole record, and those dynamics are of course meant to represent the sudden leaps and nosedives of a roller coaster, but I think they could pretty easily also represent the internal volatility at the source of an unstable relationship. And the distortion pedal that the riffs are bolstered with just drives them into you physically. You feel each pivot down to the bottom of your stomach, and after a while you start to feel like motion sickness is about to catch up with your body. But there's something about the way the record's still so reserved on the surface and played so straight. Their setup really reminds me of that of just your typical basement band with stark audio engineering from Brian Paulson, and how understated the timbres are really just makes the instruments sound that much more resigned to their misery, especially the guitars. They're using this dated RCA ribbon mic, and much of the time Brian's vocals are so grave. He's delivering this bare, cold spoken word, and it's placed a level below everything in the mix. I imagine the character he's playing is kind of flattening his external disposition out of a certain reticence or to seem indifferent, and that the amount of mental force he's subconsciously channeling and targeting towards all of the expression inside of him would have the strength of concentrated light. It would be excruciating and headache-inducing to hold inside of him. He seems dead serious, just fixed in such a trance that you couldn't snap him out of if you tried. His words just create such an aura around everything, and time seems to stop around them. It's petrifying. No expression is flowing through him. It's like he's mentally inhibited to the point of being physically tense as well. I imagine his muscles, especially his face muscles, just clenching into a ball, or solidifying or freezing, and eventually forming this agonizing ice burn. But he almost whispers on Nosferatu Man, and whispers are slipped into Dane Man, which kind of reminds me of someone purposefully adding this subtle element of mystery to their pain, or to how distant they are, to sensationalize it, because out of a certain desperation they actually want you to suspect that there's more going on with them, but they'll never outright express it. If this line of thought continued, I could easily see it manifesting in all of these toxic ways. He's likely attracted to it because it would allow him to stay there soaked in the sheer purity of the emotion and directly feel that jet black razor sharp sorrow and just let it sting. But the thing is, I imagine it becoming this electric current that would shock him into an altered state and continue to circuit through his whole body and spread mental poison into every part of him. And actually, the lyricism on these tracks strikes me as some of the least emotionally developed on the record as well. Nosferatu Man, of course, uses this vampire character, I think, to depict this exploitative relationship where one person is pretty much just using and draining the life out of the other, and then just one day pulling the plug and cutting them off. I find that the precise way that this track is worded really just evokes their remorselessness and resolute lack of empathy. In Like a Bat, I Flushed the Girl, flushed implies she's disposable. Set a Fire Burning, of course, suggests this destruction, and then Railed On Through the Night suggests they kind of just keep trucking forward numbly, incessantly, and without contrition. The ugly screeching tones on this track sound like they're interjecting from the opposite direction that the instrumentation's already moving in and kind of pulling it back for a second. It's as if they could represent this impulse that's just forceful enough to actually violently rewire the linear course of thoughts in the brain in this penetrating rush of adrenaline, and they straight up sound like they're surrounded in dirt and just scraping through to this natural human filth or corruption and kind of following the narrator, finding that that already exists in certain corners of his subconscious, and recognizing for a second his ability to rise above everyone and everything he thought he was vulnerable to and actually turn on people, and feeling how impossibly exhilarating that sensation is, he could think it's enough to shoot him through the grieving process without complication. I think that for me, it's this idea of someone with a brain that has the same fundamentals as mine actually breaking through their moral code and even feeling the need to consider the ethical inflection of the things they do, and simultaneously Brian's whispering convincing me that his character's even weirdly into it that just sends chills down my spine. And there's a sensory shift towards the end of the record where this feeling of aftermath starts to shine through it, and you could hypothetically decide it's connected to the death of this relationship, since I do think that that's what's at the center of the narrative, but something about the transition feels bigger picture than that, so I like to see it as simultaneously being illustrative of something that's actually ubiquitous, and that's the way that, figuratively speaking, most of us quietly undergo this internal death through the course of time, and it's likely the result of just repeatedly living through the end of so many of our pursuits and so much of what we put our soul into, or the lives that we settle into in the long term just make us so claustrophobic. So I envision reality as being like this body of water covering all of the multicolored, frantic introspection that Brian's astir with and smothering it from the outside in, and you can sense the way that it burns in his stifled words until eventually all that's left is this corpse that flows with this macabre, sick grace, and the spindly skeleton parts that would turn up just miserably sprawled out on the surface remind me of the guitar tones here. So raw, so depleted, so lifeless. The moment where Washer's volume significantly dwindles right before the climax always rings out with such importance in my head when I'm thinking about this record, because in retrospect, when I'm re-listening to it, I know that it's just about to fall into this unforeseen pit in For Dinner, which almost feels like it's simulating a death-like state. It's like it's pulling away your very grasp of consciousness. And it just happens so abruptly, it really is a devastating drop. And within Washer, the instruments do kind of intermittently retract, and that opens this conspicuous space which your ears just latch right onto, and that makes the drums seem like they lash it that much more sharply and deafeningly, and you have to physically recoil in response to them. There's just something so merciless and morbid about the sound of those blows. It's kind of foreboding, but this track still maintains this palpable human touch as well. It's as if the essence of the remains of that deadness is being gracefully swept through the chords between the verses, and they're just enveloping you so affectionately. This track's tempo is slower, so it makes the instruments sound so enervated. It's like they're just collapsing onto it in submission to defeat. And the lyricism is addressed to someone directly. Brian is gently bidding someone farewell. It seems he's momentarily found this stability in the end of this and is actually taking pleasure in and romanticizing the idea of loss itself and in knowing everything's returned to the earth again with true finality and the sense of redemption that would naturally turn out of that. Once enough turbulence has passed through your system, it just gets so much softer and you feel cleansed in the same way you would the eye or the aftermath of a storm when there's still a bit of dampness in the air and the sky is mostly veiled with overcast, but there's a bit of light showing through. The track just has this atmosphere with a scary amount of depth. It feels like a dream that you just can't break out of, and it kind of mimics the way that Lost takes you to so many surreal places. Something about the documentary's shots of the mundane traces of the pensive outskirts of this neighborhood, the rustling trees, the lonely diners, the empty roads resonates with me as being significant. They look kind of phantasmic. Looking at them is like looking into a dream, and they also have this low frame rate, so it could be like looking into a memory as it's breaking up inside a mind, but certain poetically opulent fragments of it are still penetrating enough to just resound with this dark, heavy pulse. And honestly, I think that when I watch this documentary or I read up on this band's story, the fact that I grew up in the Midwest kind of makes the idea of this project coming out of the outskirts of a gray Midwestern town have a pretty profound impact on me, because I visualize these places so vividly and just how utterly bloodless and drawn they can feel. The thing is, anyone living in one of these places is pretty much bolted there for better or for worse, because they're either in school or they're raising a family. So by default, the suggestion of stagnance surrounds them, and often they look presentable, but their internal realities are so unsound, and that discrepancy means that this synthetic quality infiltrates the air and you're constantly just suffocating in it. And the idea of these young guys who are hypothetically full of these colliding torrents of new adolescent emotion and strange idiosyncrasies somehow steering that mess into this one honest, cutting project is really just testament to the amount of discipline and mental stamina they have. The whole concept is so vividly diametrically opposed with the energy in a place like this. And even though it was because of external circumstances outside of their control, to me, in some way, it makes sense that something this wholly and unadulteratedly genuine would just drive itself straight to its death and end right where it started. And in the Breadcrumb Trail documentary, it's implied that they still hold this time in their lives sentimentally and to high regard. They respect it. And even though in any unscripted interview you're inevitably a bit scattered, you're fumbling, trying to gather coherent, authentic thoughts, it's like you can tell that as the band is trying to open this door and re-experience this, they're realizing that they couldn't fully convey what this project was to them if they tried. I mean, not really, right? It seems like there's just so much to say, and most of it is caught in their throats. But throughout, you can tell that certain details might hit someone's nerve, and then their voice will just fade to this subdued whisper, which then dissolves into these darkened rooms. There's just this implication of pure tragedy tied to Slint's entire existence that translates so intrinsically, maybe they don't even need to elaborate. Maybe their silence even says more. I think about how we're exposed and subjected to the passage of time long after our greatest pursuits end in relationship with the way the guitars sound like bare clanging scrap metal that's slowly and visibly oxidizing, because you can become mostly just numb to the feeling in the haze of the days. Maybe nothing feels explicitly wrong, but you just have this tiny suspicion you've lost something precious that you could hardly elaborate on, but God, you feel, and it just subtly worsens underneath everything more and more each day until eventually something triggers it all to just surface, and that sharp acidic pain and metallic blood-like taste comes back. I've always thought of Good Morning Captain as being about one of these moments where the main character's realizing that some vital suspense is gone from their reality and it's simulating them re-entering their former body, and in the trembling child's eyes you can just see all the quiet desperation that's accumulated over so many years. The longer you live and the more you experience, the more you can feel the absence of, and all it really takes is for your perspective to arbitrarily slide for you to see the totality of it, and for your life to look a lot smaller in comparison, which then changes the amount of pull on the seconds, which kind of reminds me of the effect of the restrained instruments on For Dinner. They feel almost parasitic, and when the volume drops enough and all that's left is these tiny chords and hi-hat nicks, they become actively taunting, because it's like their sole reason for still being there is to make your focus shift to the terrifying negative space around them, and it's excruciating. And this track is really just like this cycle of the chords and drums inclining with a convincing sense of hope, and then falling just as quickly, and then persisting, but the same thing happens, and it kind of reminds me of how in life you can think that you've grasped something and it's substantive and grounding, but then it might just slip through your fingers and be just as ephemeral as everything else, and that can kind of feel like this never-ending loop that we're just locked into. But despite how immediately each moment evaporates in time, there are still moments where all possibilities seem to have lined up in one's favor, and they can grasp that opportunity midair, and as they feel the sensation of catching lightning in a bottle, the force of that can become enough to break through time, and to leave this permanent imprint all around them, in the same way that Spiderland physically shook and warped the outside world, and ripples still travel through the entire landscape of music 30-some years later.